we're going to be having a look at a piece of the New Testament, specifically Paul's engagement with the people of Philippi, and I'll explain to you where it is and who Paul was and all of that. And we're going to use as our guide, firstly, Acts chapter 16, which is the explanation of how Paul got to be in Philippi and what he did there. And then secondly, we're also going to be using the letter to the Philippians, which is in the New Testament. Now, I have made a copy for you. I'm not 100% sure how many copies are here and whether everyone will get one, but if you need a copy of Ephesians 16, that's simply Ephesians 16. You'll notice it's printed the wrong way around. It starts like the Jews, the Hebrew on the right-hand side of the page, and it moves over to the left. I put it the wrong way around on the photocopier, but it's Acts chapter 16. If you have a Bible, and you want to read along in your own Bible, you can do that. That piece of paper, I quite like to print out when I do a Bible study, or if I do a sermon, I like to print out on the photocopier the text so that I can write on the thing. I don't mind writing in Bibles. The only problem is once you've written the first time, you can't write a second and the third time. Well, there's still enough chairs, otherwise we can bring something from that room over there. There's still two over here. Okay, so just to recap, we are looking at a piece of history from the New Testament era. The central character is Saul of Tarsus, who became known as Paul, a great missionary, an apostle in the early church on the day of Pentecost. And we're going to be honing in on the experience in Philippi, or among the Philippian people. And I'll tell you where that is and so on. And if you want to, later on, from next week and so on, there will be pieces of the letter to the Philippians, which is in the New Testament, that we will use as well. Okay? There are 5 sessions. Today is the first, the 7th of June is the last, same time, same place, 3 o'clock. Now, by the way, if we have load shedding over this time, then we'll move into the church because there's a battery in there. So I can still use the screen and so on. I know it's starting at 4 o'clock, but I won't need it. I'm aiming for between an hour and an hour and a half on a Wednesday afternoon. So I will make a commitment to you that I won't go past 4, but it won't be shorter than an hour. So between now and an hour and a half on a Wednesday afternoon, 5 of them. Today's the 1st, the 7th of June is the last. Next week, you will have the privilege of being taught by a teacher, I'm sure better than I, and that's Kim Brown. She's going to teach next session, and so far, I'm going to teach this. Okay, so that's the broad outline. Paul, Philippians, the second missionary journey. You want to know, he had a few of those. The second missionary journey is what we're dealing with. And there's a great theme that runs through, and I want you to remember this theme because I'm going to try to come back to it on a weekly basis. The theme is called the Clash of Empires. The Clash of Empires. And the short answer to what these empires are, the first one is the Roman Empire. That was the prevailing empire of the day, right? But I mean, if it was our day, you could, I don't know, it's a little bit more subtle nowadays. The Western world is kind of an empire in itself. It's got a world view, and it's got a value system, it's got an economic system, and so on. And then, I guess, communism is another one. And maybe, I don't know, there's various forms, China and so on. These are empires. But in that day, it was pretty clear that the area that we're looking into, the first growth of the church, out of Jerusalem, was around the Mediterranean, and all of it was under the Roman Empire. Even North Africa was under the Roman Empire at this time, right? So that's the one empire. Now, which empire is it clashing with? It's the empire we call the Kingdom of God. Okay, where God is king. Caesar is not king. God is king. So those two empires are clashing, and we will try and work out why. Why are they clashing? What's different about these two empires? And we'll see, as we move through these 5 sessions, various ways in which Paul comes slap bang against the Roman Empire over and over again, because he's preaching a gospel that doesn't fit in this particular empire, that has different values and so on. Okay? Let's say prayer. We thank you that you reign supreme, and that even although we may live in different value systems in the world in which we live, South African society, here in Somerset West, continent of Africa, in a Western-orientated world, and so on, that all of these things stand next to another citizenship that we have, Lord, and that is the citizenship in your kingdom. We are there because you've allowed us, you've adopted us as sons and daughters for rights, and we are yours. And so we live in this in-between moment, between what the world requires of us and what your kingdom expects of us. So help us in these next few weeks to understand more and more about what you are all about. Thank you, Lord. Okay, so I want to draw your attention to the Bible text first, and then we can start there and read how did Paul come to be in contact with the Philippians, the people of Philippi. So if you're reading my copy, you're going to have to start on the right, and you're going to have to move to the center and into the last column. Sorry about that. He came to Derbe and then to Lystra, where a disciple named Timothy lived, whose mother was a Jewess and a believer, but whose father was a Greek. The brothers at Lystra and Iconium spoke well of him. Paul wanted to take him, that's Timothy, along with on the journey, so he circumcised him because of the Jews who lived in that area, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. As they traveled from town to town, they delivered the decisions reached by the apostles and the elders in Jerusalem for people to obey. If you want to read about those decisions, you can read in Acts 15. It's the so-called Council of Jerusalem. So the churches were strengthened in faith, and they grew daily in numbers. Paul and his companions traveled throughout the region of Phrygia and Galatia, having been kept by the Holy Spirit from preaching the word in the province of Asia. When they came to the border of Mysia, they tried to enter Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus would not allow them to. So they passed by Mysia and went down to Troas. During the night, Paul had a vision of a man of Macedonia standing and begging him, "Come over to Macedonia to help us." After Paul had seen the vision, he got ready at once to leave Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. From Troas, he put out to sea and sailed straight for Samothrace, and the next day on to Neapolis. From there he travelled to Philippi, a Roman colony, and the leading city of that district of Macedonia. And we stayed there several days. Let's stop there for a moment. So, we're dealing with Paul here. You've heard about Paul. Paul was not one of the disciples of Jesus. Paul was a trained Pharisee. He was a religious person and had been trained in the Old Testament. He was one of the clever ones. You know, in those days, if you wanted to be a rabbi, well, all children really wanted to be a rabbi, because a rabbi was seen as something special. So, which is very different from today. But anyway, so you were enlisted in the rabbinical school by your parents, about 6 years old, right? And you went to the school. Of course, you had to be a boy, because in those days, girls didn't go to rabbinical school. Anyway, so you went to school around 6, and basically school was reading and writing, but the way in which they tested you was your memory and your ability to memorize. So the first task you were given, between about 6 and 10, was to memorize the Torah. Now the Torah is, for Christians, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. The first 5 books of the Old Testament, right? And between the ages of 6 and 10, your job, apart from learning to read and write, was to memorize the Torah. Okay? And the rabbis would test you. They would say, okay, come on, Jaime, stand up and tell us, what does Moses say, in the book of Numbers chapter, I don't know how I'm not 100% sure how they divided these books. Because I know that the chapters and the verses are modern constructs. When the Bible was made ready for, after the printing press, they put in these divisions so that we could find our way. We didn't have to say, well, find so-and-so, we could say, turn to chapter so-and-so and verse so-and-so. So I don't know exactly how the Jews in that day divided it up. But the Torah was the first thing. Now, when you came to 10 years old, you would be given a big exam. And the big exam would be about your memorization of the Torah. So each little boy was asked and so on, and those who managed could go on. But those who could not manage, they exited the rabbinical school at 10 years old, and they took on a trade, mostly the trades of their parents. So you could become, like James and John, the sons of Zebedee, a fisherman. And you would go out with your father on the boat from 10, and you would have to mend the nets, and you would learn the trade. Mending the nets, fishing, and all the things, skills required for a fisherman to make his living and to feed his family off the Sea of Galilee or wherever, Mediterranean. Then from 10, they stepped it up a notch. Okay? They said, okay, now you know the Torah. But now we want you to memorize the writings and the poetry section and the prophecy section. And so between 10 and around 17, you were enlisted in memorizing the rest. You would go through Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Samuel, all the way through, and then Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, all the way through. And you would build one year upon the next, but it was a memorization. That basically is what school for boys was like in that time. And again, at age 17, there would be a test. And if you could manage, if you could find your way around, if you'd memorized well, then you could go on. And I'll explain what on is, but if you couldn't, then it was an exit at that point. And again, you go and you become like Jesus' family, carpenters, or workers. You know that the word that is used to describe Jesus' father's trade, Joseph's trade, is a wide word. So we don't know if it was a carpenter or he could have been a builder, because they used a similar word to describe it. It was a person who built things with their hands, whether they made things out of wood or whether they built dwellings or whatever. It's the same thing. So that was the system. It was very simple, but very hard, you can imagine. All that memorization. But if you, at 17, passed the test, if you were able to do the memorization, then they would say, okay, off you go, find for yourself a rabbi. That was the final step. Find for yourself a rabbi and ask that rabbi to teach you how to interpret what you know. So all that memorization of the Old Testament, which was the Bible for the Jews, find for yourself a rabbi and ask that rabbi to teach you how to interpret those things. Now, there is a line that Jesus uses, and this will help you, and I'm sure you've heard it before. Take my yoke upon you, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Now, a yoke was another way of talking about a system, a mechanism, a method to interpret Scripture. So you would ask the rabbi for his yoke, and the rabbi would teach you. And what would the rabbi say to you if he accepted you? Because many rabbis said, he might ask you a question or two. So tell me about what did Moses do then and there, just to check if you really were worth your salt, so to speak. And if you were, he would say, come and follow me. And then you walk behind him and you watch, just like an electrician, or a fitter and turner, or a tool and die maker, a tradesman. Just as someone watches you when you are a tradesman, because that is your apprentice. You see, it's the same. An apprentice need to develop my own style, because when I'm ready, he's going to say to me, God, you're a rabbi now. Go teach for yourself. Right? Of course, when Jesus did it, you must understand it was the opposite way around. Number one, Jesus didn't choose the clever ones. He chose the ones who were chucked out of school and were fishermen, or tax collectors, or whatever they were. You know, you can go through the list of disciples and figure it out. Most of them were not. The ones that were very clever, highly qualified. Okay? So Jesus chose the ones that he wanted to choose. And the second point is that Jesus chose them, they didn't choose him. When you went out of school, you chose your own rabbi. It's not that the rabbi came and chose you. Jesus did the opposite way around. And Jesus said, come and follow me. And they followed. So it's a very... But anyway, the reason I'm telling you all this stuff, this tangent, is to realize that Paul was not one of those disciples. Paul was a clever boy. He'd been through the whole system. He himself could teach. And that's why you see such incredible arguments and beautiful writing in the New Testament, especially in Romans, because Paul could hold an argument. Paul could figure out a theological problem. Peter and the others, not so much. They had what Jesus taught, and they passed it on. And that's all he wanted anyway. But Paul, I think, was in a way, I'm going to say, a special gift to the church. In one way, he was special because he indeed was a very special person. In another way, Paul is special too. He's difficult, complicated. He has his moods. If you read the Bible, just try to get a feel for Paul. You know, I had a teacher called Professor Kiesweiler. He died earlier this year. He was only 80. But Professor Weiman used to say, "What a feel the Bible. What a feel. It's not just read. Feel. What's happening? What's happening? Let it get into you. It's not a normal book. You must feel what's happening. Well, you know, Paul, why are you so cross? Why are you so cross? Who's pursuing you around the place and making your life a living hell? Because there were times of that. Why? Or why are you so happy, Paul? Because when I read this, it sounds like a hymn to me. There are parts like that. It sounds like a hymn. You know? You've got to feel it, and that's what I'm hoping you'll also figure out together. So here's Paul. He's persecuting the Christians. Jesus was a threat to the religious leaders of his day. The people in the temple didn't like him. And why didn't they like him? Because if you needed to be healed, you came to the temple for prayer. Now Jesus was running his own little operation on the side here. And people were really getting healed. So it's upsetting. You know, they're not paying their tithes here. They're going over there to get healed. He doesn't want any money from them. What the heck is going on here? He's turning our lives, making our lives misery. That's what the temple people thought. Paul was one of the Pharisees. He was one of the establishment. He didn't like them to rock the boat. And anyway, he thought this was a cooked up scheme. You know, sometimes when I used to drive down the road in Johannesburg on the N12, and there was big signs, prophet and apostle. I used to think, for goodness sake. I don't know, they might have been doing good things, but they irritated me because of the names they used for themselves. I could quite happily have been wrong. They probably were doing very good work. But Paul was also driving down the road and saying, all these Jesus freaks, what are they on about? And one day he set out from Jerusalem to Damascus in Syria, because there was a rumor that a Christian community was forming there, and he was going to sort it out. So it caused trouble, so that they dispersed. And there on the road to Damascus, like a Eugene Blanche, he fell off the horse and lay there in the dust. Probably didn't have a horse, but anyway. He lay there in the dust. And he received a vision from the Lord. And after that he said, I am one of them. And not only am I not one of them. I'm one of them, like abnormally born. I wasn't one of the disciples of Jesus. But now I've got to do their job because he has so convinced me. It was a beautiful thing that happened, and we don't know the detail, but we know that he found himself among those same Christians in Damascus. But he was blind, couldn't do a thing. And there he lay under the ministry of a man called Ananias. And slowly but surely his heart changed. He got soft on the inside, and he started to get involved in the movement. But when he did, he was very, very keen. More keen than the disciples were happy to accept. Because the disciples of Jesus were terrified of him. Yeah, he comes wanting to preach, and they can't take him at his word. Because, what happened here? They went on the road to Damascus. What happened? So slowly but surely he had to bring them over and persuade them that he was the real deal, that he had been changed by God. Okay? So this is the Paul that we have. Now Paul found himself eventually as a member of a congregation in Antioch in Syria. I have a map here that doesn't have Antioch in Syria. I wanted to show you this map because there's some funny names. There's some funny names in this, of place names in this video. So basically, Paul finds himself, you can't see Antioch in Syria here, but it's about there. So if you think of this as the Mediterranean, now I've honed in on Western Turkey and Greece for a reason, I'll tell you why, but let's just use this map because I didn't prepare a map specifically on Antioch. But if you can imagine, this blue here is the Mediterranean Sea, right? This here is Greece, and this over here is Turkey, and over there behind this sign you would have a modern day Istanbul, Constantinople. It's the place where the two continents meet, Asia on the one side, Europe on the other, right? And this of course is the Black Sea. Right? Now if you come along the bottom here, past Turkey, then you will get there Syria and Lebanon, right? Syria has a border with Turkey, and then Lebanon, and then Israel down. And if you go past Israel, eventually you get to Egypt, right? So that's what we're talking about here. This over here is the island of Cyprus. This little piece down there, the island of Cyprus, right? Okay, now, somewhere over there, in Syria, is a place called Antioch, and that's where Paul found himself as a member of the congregation. It was a group of people, in those days they didn't have buildings. They didn't have paid ministers. It was just a gathering of believers, right? Sometimes it could be quite big, but many times it started very small, just in homes. And there was another man there called Barnabas, and I think because he was a good antidote to Paul, because Paul was rather feisty and Barnabas was calm, they put the two of them together, which is always a good thing when you're sending out missionaries, is to put them together, and they sent them out. And Paul and Barnabas did a missionary journey, known as the first missionary journey. Basically, it was around here, into Galatia. It was the middle of Turkey. If you look at the Turkish map today, around a little bit over to the west, but central, is where Galatia was. And there's cities like, there's another Antioch, just to confuse you. Now, Paul has come from Antioch in Syria, but there was another Antioch called Antioch of Pisidia, and that was in Turkey. And Paul basically had a system. He went in a circular route. So he would start at a city closest to where he landed, and then he would plant a church, teach, and so on. And then when there was a group of people together, they would move on. And he would go to the next city, and eventually he would come back to that city, and then go home. And whenever he toured again, like in the second missionary journey, he did a quick tour of these churches that he planted just to see how they are, and then he went further. Okay? So that was his basic strategy. Right. Now, Paul and Barnabas did the first missionary journey, they came home. And then it was decided to send Paul again on another missionary journey. He was a great evangelist. He could teach the gospel in a simple way, and many people found that it was something they could understand and relate to, and they wanted to be part of it, right? He finds Timothy, as we read in our passage today, and Timothy becomes his partner. There are other mentions of other people. Silas at one point. and John Mark at one point, who is suggested to be the writer of the second gospel. So that's where we are. I wanted to point out to you where these places are. When you read in the text about Galatia, this is Turkey, more or less central, and more or less central from the coast is Galatia, right? But I want to tell you something else which you might not know. Of course, Turkey, we say Turkey, and then we think of the Ottoman Turks, and so on, and Muslim people, and all that. That is a modern thing. The people who lived in this country in Paul's day, well, firstly, Islam wasn't a thing. It hadn't yet become a religion, right? And, these people were not Arabs. These people were Central European people, let's call them that, okay? So when I talk about Central European, I'm talking about from Eastern Europe, Hungary, Bulgaria, all those Eastern Europe, but even into the center, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, so those people are the people who lived in this area. To that side was the Persians, and down there, were multiplicity of people. But you can't think modern day Turkey when you're looking at ancient Turkey. Those governments are not the same, the religion was not the same, the people were not the same, they were different. And just to make matters even more complicated, here along the coast opposite Greece, those were Greek cities. The Greeks had colonized this coast. This is the Aegean, we call this the Aegean Sea, the sea between Greece and Turkey. All this here, they were Greek cities. So Greece, by the way, Greece, even the word Greece is a bit weird to use because the Greeks started out in cities. The Athenians versus the Corinthians versus the Spartans, they were different. They were city-states. They didn't have a consolidated country. The first time they became a consolidated country was under the father of Alexander the Great, Philip of Macedon. Okay? So I'm just giving you this for a bit of background. So all these cities along here, along this coast, was all Greek cities. Greek on this side, Greek on that side. Okay? And they had a Greek culture. More often than not, they governed themselves, each city by themselves. And if they had a mayor or a king or whatever they called him, archon or whatever, a first citizen, that was how they did. And they made treaties with each other, and they had trade with each other, and they also traded throughout the Mediterranean, but they were Greek cities. Right? So when Paul goes and teaches, a good way to think about it, when you read the book of Revelation, there's 7 churches. Laodicea, Sardis, blah, 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 Philadelphia, so those are all Greek cities, and they're all here. The island of Patmos is over here or over here. One of these tiny little islands is where John was writing the book of Revelation. He was writing to cities over there. Ephesus, one of the most important ones. It's all Greek cities. So Paul is among Greek people. He's teaching them in Greek, which is very accomplished in. All the letters in the New Testament written in Greek. And when he goes over, he starts in Galatia, and then eventually gets to Philippi, which I think is probably around there. Somewhere there, Philippi. Right. Questions, comments, thoughts? That's a kind of technical introduction.
And then, of course, you got the Roman Empire on top.
Yes, now the Romans ruled the entire Mediterranean world. From Spain up to the Alps. At some point they went further than the Alps, but in Paul's day, Alps you could say, and then across here, Greece was under Roman, and Philippi itself was a Roman colony. You'll see that in the story. All of Turkey, down the Mediterranean, all the Roman Empire to the modern Thrace. Thrace is it's a part of it's not quite part of Greece, but it's that section over there. I don't know what it is today. What is it on the other side of it? Is it more Turkey? I don't know, that's where Constantinople is.
Yeah,
But it's one of
I
those,
think that's more, that's, the Balkan, part of the Balkans.
you know, Albania maybe.
Thrace was known as, Thracians were feared, even by
Yes.
the Romans.
Yeah. So if you look here, that section of Greece was called Achaia. This section Macedon.
And where would Spain be at the moment?
Okay, Spain would be, you'd come past Greece, and then after Greece you'd get Italy, and then you'd get a bit of France, and then you'd get Spain. Yeah, over here. So we kind of honed in, because I want you to see this. Pergamum, for example, was a kingdom under a king. So Turkey was not a combined country. It was
George, how do you explain the fact that every Jewish young man was able to recite the Old Testament word for word?
well, not everyone was, because remember at 10 years old they chucked out the people like George who could do it, and he had to go and take a trade. And then those that were left at 17, so only a small group were able to recite the whole Old Testament. They became rabbis. So it was a sifting process.
It's saying something to us.
No,
There's
sure.
a level of collective devotion towards the scripture.
No doubt.
We don't even get anywhere near.
No doubt. But you see, that was the means by which they trained reading and writing in those days. And that's the way they did it. Now, look, nowadays, I mean, I'm not an educationalist, but I mean, people who are into education would tell you that people learn in different ways. So some of those poor guys that went into the system were doomed to failure, because memorization was never going to work for them. Their brains were not set up in that way. So in some ways it was a little bit skewed, but what it certainly did do, and I think what you're pointing out, is that it gave them an orientation to their faith that we don't have. We didn't even have under apartheid. You know, when we sang hymns in assembly and that, we had no depth of our faith like they must have had. Even the ones that dropped out, they would have had a depth of understanding because the means that was used was the scriptures. See, they didn't have books. The printing press came in the 15, 1600s. So they had hand illuminated manuscripts. Those scribes and so on would sit. I mean, how long would it have taken you to write out the whole of the Old Testament? It was a life's work. And then that was one scroll. And the scroll could go to one synagogue. And then the other, everybody needed scrolls.
Which was part of the reason why they did not let this Holy Scripture out of the synagogue.
Yeah.
Because it was that important.
Yes.
Firstly, anything that held the name of God was holy.
Yeah.
And you don't want this very expensive piece of literature to go anywhere.
Yeah, it was written on vellum or on parchment, and that's why some of those things are still legible today. I joke, my friend, my colleague, had a parents-in-law who used to run Simonsburg, which is a Presbyterian conference centre. It's basically, it's between Kanonkop and Edcake on the Clubnitz Road. It's a piece of ground that we own, and it's a conference centre, youth camp or whatever. But his mother-in-law used to make some lovely things. Maybe it's just memories. When you eat food, memories are a big part of it. So, for my wife and my children, macaroni, is special. I can't understand it. It's a side, but for them, they have memories attached. So anyway, she made these things, and after she died, I said to my friend's wife, I said to her, which was her daughter, I said, do you have any of her recipes? There were two particular things I asked for, and she gave them to me. Well, they were brown, they'd faded, and obviously they'd been put next to the cooking pots and so on. And I said to her, this looks like the Dead Sea Scrolls. But those things were well loved and used, and you could can see the wear and tear on the wrist. Anyways, okay. Let's move on a little bit. I want to show you something, and I'm a little bit nervous because no change is happening. I won't be able to show it to you if I don't start now. It's on the video. I hope it's kept its place. So Ray van der Laan, who is in this particular piece, is teaching in situ, and he's going to talk to you and to us about a place called the Via Egnatia. Via means road. Egnatia is the name of the road that linked Turkey with Greece. Okay? And Paul walking along that road, because the Roman roads are one of the biggest reasons the gospel spread. Because before that it was felt, and they built roads, and you could walk down the roads, and there were often centuries, so you could walk safely, because let me tell you, if you think hijacking is a thing today, hijacking was a big thing in the time of Paul. I mean, you could get killed, and nobody would know. So Ray van der Laan is going to teach us, and I'm going to put it on now. I would have put it on a bit later, but I want to do it now because 4 o'clock is the load shedding.
First back through Galatia, takes his first real disciple,
This is
Timothy. He wants to go to Asia, the Spirit of God won't let him. Doesn't say how, but wouldn't let him. Tries to go north into Bithynia, the Spirit of God wouldn't let him. So everywhere he tries to go, boom, the door is shut. And so he just keeps heading west until he came to Troas. At Troas, he has a vision of a man from Macedonia. The man said, "We need help. Come and help us." And Paul took that as God's instruction that the next step was not north or south or Rome, but here, in the Roman province of Macedonia. So Paul got on a boat at Troas in modern Turkey near the ancient city of Troy, sails all day, night, stopped over at the island of Samothrace, and then continued to Neapolis, about 10 miles that way on this road. From there, he and Silas and Luke and Timothy down the road to the first major city on this road. For you, I don't know what your man of Macedonia is. It may be right where you are. Your life's occupation, your life's calling, I don't know. I do know this. If that's where God has called you, the road is ready. You'll take care of that. You don't have to say, "Okay, God, I think you want me to go here." That road was ready long before Paul. In fact, this road was actually paved after around 168 BC. So it had been in place already almost 200 years. Maybe 200 years, maybe more than 200 years before Paul used it. And God said, "Come on, Paul, it's in place. What do you think? I'm not going to be ready." So go to your Macedonia, whatever it is, whether it's where you are now or in some place new. So let's join Paul. Let's see once where he ended up as he headed then from Neapolis, where he got off the boat, to the first stop on the Via Egnatia. Come, let's go. that ancient city of Philippi. Takes up almost a whole chapter in the book of Acts, and he writes an entire book to the believers that will come to know Messiah in that city. I think it's just amazing to come and see that. We're on the Acropolis. Not much up here, but a stunning view nevertheless. If you look back towards east, you see more or less the route that the Via Ignatia would have taken. It runs through Philippi as Decumanus. Let me tell you the history of this place. Back way before Paul's time, people from the island of Thasos founded a settlement here called Trinities. But they were harassed by the local Thracian tribes. So in the 300s, mid-300s, they got in touch with a Macedonian king who was west of here a bit, whose name was Philip II. You know him as Alexander the Great's father. And said, come on over and help us with this problem we've got. Philip gladly obliged, and of course, not only came and helped them with the Thracians, but came and basically made the city his own. And either he or his son Alexander, I can find both in the records, changed the name to the city of Philippi. In 168, Rome finally took this as her own. Then comes one of the most significant moments in the history of the world, certainly in the history of the biblical world. In Rome, Rome was ruled by two consuls who served at the same time for 1 year. And then it would change. It was the Roman way to be a republic. You didn't end up with a king or an emperor like their ancient tribal ancestors had had. Then Julius Caesar does the unthinkable. He wins a victory in Gaul and marches his army right into Rome and demands to be thought of as the king, the ruler. Maybe not called the king, but he basically takes power, realizing, as one author writes, you can have a republic or an empire, but you're not going to have both. And Julius apparently decides he prefers an empire to a republic. Now, there were some who said, no way. We're not going to allow our Constitution to go down the drain. We're going to remain a republic. So in March 15 of 44 BC, those republic supporters assassinated Julius Caesar as the Senate met. And Julius was finished. They fled east, Cassius and Brutus, his assassins, and raised an army to come back to Rome to make sure that they remained a republic. Julius's adopted son Octavian and one of his greatest generals, Mark Antony, raised an army in Rome and said, no, we will be an imperial empire. And they came marching east to face Cassius and Brutus. They met on the plain of Germania. That battle will determine whether there is an imperial power and an emperor who calls himself the Son of God with a gospel that says, I am the Savior of the world at the time Jesus is born, or whether it will still be a republic. If you look out in the valley, you see two small hills. Picture Mark Antony camped on the left. More than 25,000 Romans. Octavian, who will be Augustus Caesar someday, on the right. Cassius is camped just out of the swamps down here on the left, with a huge advantage of the city walls of Philippi. And Brutus, at the foot of the hill, with the defense of the hill and the city as well. There were two battles. One on October 3 of 42 BC. In that battle, Mark Antony flanked Cassius and cut off his supply route. Cassius was so panicked that he committed suicide. And his part in the whole war ended. Brutus actually defeated Octavian, who ran for his life. The two sides retrenched, and on October 23, Brutus made a fatal mistake. He left the safety of the hill and the city walls and set out to attack his enemy. And he lost. He was given a proper burial, and his head sent to Rome and placed at the foot of the statue of Julius Caesar in the Forum. And the world began to change. About 10 years later, 350 miles to the west, at a place called Actium, in 31 BC, Octavian and Antony would face off. And you know the story. Octavian, who will be Caesar Augustus, won. Antony fled to Egypt, and with his partner, his friend, Cleopatra, committed suicide as well. And Octavian is Lord and God. And the imperial climb to deification begins. His coins will say, Savior of the world. His statues will say, the deified one. His gospel will say, peace, security has come. The golden age, as his writers will put it. And Caesar will be Lord and God. There's an altar in Rome called the Ara Pacha, the altar of peace. Scholars interpret the four panels to say, piety, let's get back to the gods of our founders. War, victory, and then Roman peace. Caesar's way of bringing the good news of the kingdom of the Son of God. The imperator means dominator or conqueror. Augustus Caesar. And that road is the road Cassius and Brutus came on. That way, Octavian and Antony met here. And I like to picture those legions with their uniforms. As the two meet, history decides that there will be a divine Son of God on the throne when the Messiah, the Son of the living God, arrives. So what happens when this Jew, with his kingdom of God, kingdom of priests, tassels, comes walking on the Via Egnatia into a Roman colony where the Lord is the king? Caesar, Lord and God. Let's see. That's a good climb. We made that climb to the top of the Acropolis to discover the lengths that Octavian would go to become Caesar, Caesar Augustus, Lord and God. Paul came to declare Jesus Lord and God. But the way Jesus came to authority and lordship was very different. There's a place in the ruins that I think illustrates clearly that difference. Let's go see. here we have what's known as a hero. A little hard to tell exactly what was here. The church was built over it later, and it obscured some of it, but it was built here. At least it was here in Paul's time. You know what a hero is in the Greek world? And I would have said before, sure, it's somebody who does great things. We've got heroes too. But it was much more than that in the Greek and Roman world. In their world, if somebody had accomplished what appeared to be superhuman things, usually after their death, community would gather, talk about, decide what they had done that appeared superhuman. You know, the Abraham Lincolns of their day, I suppose. And then they would be honored because it was believed the gods had given them the gift of deification. Not that they became the eternal gods, that's different, but they were deified. After death, they were given some of the privileges and powers of gods. People like Ulysses and Hercules and Asclepius and Perseus and Alexander the Great, for that matter. In some ways, that was what was being done for Caesar even while he was still alive. And they would build a structure then, a small temple, and you can see the steps of that here. And they would gather here to honor and venerate and worship that particular hero. I don't think they thought those heroes could really do anything. Some of their divine powers might rub off a little bit, but rather they might have influence with the gods themselves. At least that's how I read it, what they were doing here. And so a heron is a place where you honor somebody that accomplished during their lifetime what was necessary to be deified. Now notice how well that fits that system. That you live your life to put yourself on the top of the heap. And if it means using others, now this one, they think, is probably Philip II's heron. Now that's important, because Philip II wasn't just Philip II. That's Alexander the Great's father, and a powerful, powerful king in his own right, who was seeking deification already in his own lifetime. In fact, he was at his daughter's wedding, and there were 12 statues brought in of the 12 main Olympian gods, and then a statue number 13 of Philip. And as that statue was brought in, he was struck down by a couple of his bodyguards. So even at the end of his life, he's still trying to position himself on the top, using others to reach the top. And I just see a structure like this as being a classic monument to people who will use others for their own benefit to make themselves the top of the heap. Now imagine we get that inspired email. Well, I didn't have email, but that inspired letter from Paul. Listen to what he writes to the city of Heron. That is, listen to what he writes to Philippi, where the Heron of Philip was. Famous Heron. Your attitude, your mind, ought to be the same as that of Christ Jesus. That's a high bar. Who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking the form of a servant, being found in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross. Therefore God exalted him to the highest place, and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of the Father. Now I don't know about you, but I think there's some real irony in that, because that is absolutely a heron turned upside down. That flips the script. That's absolutely backwards. In their world, a hero is somebody who's trying to reach the top of the heap, climbing over everyone else in the process. In Jesus' case, it's someone who has the very nature of God, but empties himself of some use of those divine powers in order to become a humble servant and give himself a sacrifice for others. And that, I would like to suggest, is how the kingdom of the Heavenly Father comes. It's a power too. A power to transform culture as well as transform the lives, the hearts, the minds of individuals. But notice Paul says, your life, your attitude ought to be like that. So Paul came here to say, I'm going to tell you about Lord and God, Jesus the Messiah. But the way that empire, that kingdom works, is exactly the opposite of what your world considers normal. So the model for us, not the Rome, but the life and attitude of Jesus. Are you ready to be part of that kingdom? Are you ready to humble yourself as a citizen of the kingdom of heaven? Showing the world what it looks like when heaven's practices begin here, at least in some way. It will mean sacrificing yourself, picking up your cross for others. Come.
Okay. So, I let it run quite long because there were two things I wanted to show you there. Firstly, to give you the sense of the Via Natia, which was a road running through Turkey on the way to Rome, but of course crossing Greece as well. And that the Philippi had a history. It wasn't just a place without a background. And the history was the clash of the Republicans, the people who understood Rome as run by a Senate, representative democracy in a way, but also then the big change that came through Julius Caesar and eventually Octavian, who became Augustus. So the Roman Empire was first a republic and became an empire, which means run by a king. Right? The king used words of himself, and the Romans used words of their king that would jar with us today. And I'm sure that when you heard that, the way that he is referred to, you might realize it's going to come a major problem here. Because the king of Rome, or Caesar, is now the Son of God. A God himself, to be worshipped in his lifetime. Previously, as he said there, if there was a venerated person or a very powerful king, after they died, they were considered to be a deity, right? Have godlike characteristics. But with Augustus, look, his name is Octavian, but he calls himself Augustus, which is not his name. That is, means, you can see August, powerful, strong. You know, that's really what
The Roman title, what he was basically doing is, those two titles did exist, Caesar and Augustus, but they were two different titles. He comes of everything on himself.
He is, everything that you can think of that's powerful is him. That's what he's saying. And in fact, it was used after him as well. But so can you see now how there's a major problem? We don't live in a secular, living in Rome in that time was not a secular society. Those old pagan religions now vest in the political head, right? We must revere him. You know? Now, I don't know if you're going to let down my tires, but if you watched last Saturday, you would have seen some things there that would have made you slightly uncomfortable in the service of coronation. Because they are relics of the Roman era. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with Charlie. I'm just saying there are relics of the Roman era in that service. Okay? And, those of us who, who are believers or whatever, I'm saying it's separating political from religious, because then if they mess up like they always do, then you think, oh well, it's only political age. You can't expect him to behave, perfectly. Person, not around also.
That correlation offends us in terms of our belief in the separation of church and state.
Yeah, look, it didn't offend me. I'm trying to work out the word. There were some parts of it I watched that made me uncomfortable. And I took them for what they were. So I said, okay, I can see there that is going back. The anointing of a king goes back to the biblical era. But of course, when God chooses a king, it's okay, to anoint him. But if God has nothing to do with the choice of a king, and certainly remember, Israel's monarchy was not supposed to be familial. It wasn't supposed to go down in the family line. God chose Saul, and he chose David. He didn't choose Solomon. That was an innovation. They decided, okay, now we're going to do it this way. So when God chooses a king and you anoint him, that's one thing. But if a family line is royalty, that's a human decision. But don't pour oil in his head, because that's a religious symbol.
I was really impressed how much God was involved in that.
Whether you liked it or not.
Well, I've been to a wedding. I liked it very much.
Whether God liked it or not.
Oh, maybe not. But I've been to weddings where some arbitrary guy comes along in a pair of jeans and blesses the couple. No biblical, nothing to it. So for me, I love that they pay the bands for the King of Kings.
Oh yes, look, let me not be misunderstood here. There are some beautiful parts to that liturgy. And I was under no illusion who the King of Kings was and who the smaller king is. So I don't want to create the impression that the whole thing was. I'm just saying there's strands of thinking that come from the Roman world and that went through Charlemagne and the Holy Roman Empire and has made its way into the way in which the UK anoints its king. They wouldn't. I mean, the best of politicians would not realize it or be offended by it. And I'm not actually offended, I'm just noticing it and I see it for what it is. And that thing there, you're anointing a king, I'm not so sure that that's an appropriate symbol. Chosen to use it, fair enough, it's your choice. But, as you say, that liturgy, I listen very carefully, that liturgy, you are left in no doubt who the King of Kings is. And if it wasn't for that, I would be offended. If it wasn't for the Church of England's influence in making sure that the hierarchy is clear, and you're ruled by God's by His grace. Okay, so let's get back for a moment and conclude. So what did I want? I'm going to hand two things out if I were to send around. And if anybody doesn't get one of these, just let me know. I can make copies of this. Just send it along the road. On the one side, I've printed, Barbara has printed for you, the more or less the timeline. It's not a detailed timeline, but it gives you more or less when Paul was active, and it looks at especially his first and second mission journey. Very important to orientate yourself. And then these are some of the questions. These are some of the questions that you can have a look at in your own time. Now it should only be. Oh, is that sorry? Am I giving you my copy on the top? What about that? It's terrible. I tell you what you should have. Then open up. Give one more copy to me. Who's got that? Yeah, it's a back on back. Sorry, I put my copy on the front of this. Where's that thing along? You got it. Oh, mercy. Alright, I'll tell you what you should have. Some of them are printed back to back and others are printed single. Tell you what you should have. On the one side, you should have the Apostle Paul, a timeline for his ministry. And on the other side, you should have two maps, and underneath saying the first and second. Whether it's printed back to back or separately, it doesn't matter, as long as you've got those 2 pages. And then the next one I'm sending around has got questions about today's lesson that you can take home and work through in your own time. Is it coming around? Questions? questions are coming. Right. Let me finish up by saying this. So the point of today's lesson was to give you a broad orientation. What I really wanted to do is firstly to introduce you to the man called Paul, or as he was known when he was born, Saul of Tarsus. Tarsus is a city, a town. That's his birthplace, and it is in sort of modern-day Iraq, Syria, around there. And he was a Pharisee, a Jew, but he was also a Roman citizen. In those days, by the way, certain cities, if you were born there, you were a Roman citizen. It was an honor. It wasn't a fait accompli. When I was born, I became a South African citizen. It wasn't fait accompli. Okay, but in those days, citizenship was different. To give you an example, if you were born in ancient Athens, in Greece, if you were a woman, you were not a citizen. If you were a slave, you were not a citizen. If you were under 18 years old, a child, you were not a citizen. If you were a foreigner who had lived and worked there and had children, your children were not citizens. There were only men over 18 who were citizens. Right? So citizenship has changed. Now we have it when we're born here, or various circumstances which Paul was born in a Roman city called Tarsus and became a Roman citizen. People like the other disciples, Peter and others, were not Roman citizens. Paul was. It helped him. Got him out of jail a few times. They treated you different because you had recourse. So in other words, if something happened to you and the state was involved, you could say, I appeal to Rome. Then they would have to have it's like a constitutional court. You go straight up there and you stand in front of whoever is the magistrate in Rome. You explain your situation. And then those guys better have their taxi to Rome. Because otherwise they could say, no, you did wrong by him. Which is what happened in Philippi. So I wanted to introduce you to Paul. Then I wanted to introduce you to Philippi, a city in Greece, but I wanted to do it in the context of the Greece of Paul's day, which was modern-day Greece, but also the western coast of Turkey, the Greek cities. All under the Black Sea, under the city of Constantinople, which is Istanbul. That's the area in which Paul was born. And then finally, I want to get Ray van der Laan to show you how the kingdoms were in conflict. Because Caesar called himself the Son of God. Caesar was the one who would protect you because he was bringing peace. So, and Paul said, I want to tell you the story of the real Son of God, the real Messiah, and a peace that is very different from this violence. You know, when peace is enforced by violence, when you're too scared to fight, that's not real peace. And Paul is going to tell you about it. And the story Paul is going to tell is going to turn the Roman story upside down. You saw that. Upside down. You're not ambitious to get to the top, but the Messiah, in fact, gave away everything, even his life on a cross. So he did the opposite of what Augustus is doing. Augustus was on the up and up. Jesus was on the down, what Henry Nolan calls downward mobility. Gave it all away. That's how you achieve true greatness. It's not to take, but to give. Okay. You got those concepts? Okay. So next week, Kim is going to take you further. Please will you read that chapter 16 again? Just get it into your bones, because something happens there. There are a couple of characters that you'll be introduced to next week. One of them will be a woman called Lydia. And I want you to imagine how unbelievable it is for a woman's name to be mentioned in the book of Acts as a leader among the Philippian church. Not even a citizen. She was a citizen. Well, no, I was talking about the Greeks. The Greeks don't allow. I don't know. I can't actually remember. I was looking it up. Who were the citizens of Rome? Was Lydia a citizen? I mean, the fact is that she was a leader in the Philippian church, and that was what? but she was also the dealer in purple cloth. Ask him about that. What does it mean to be a dealer in purple cloth? So the characters are who we're going to talk about next week. Kim is going to lead you, and we're going to talk about the city of Philippi. So chapter 16 for next week, and then if you really want to be clever, then read chapter 1 of Philippians, the letter to the Philippians as well. And that will give you a great background to what we're going to do next week. Let's pray. Thank you for these inspirational stories and how you turn the ways of the world upside down. A Messiah who gives it all away and who dies on a cross, or the so-called Augustus, the King of Kings, who defeats people in battle and is victorious and claims authority for himself. Two kingdoms in conflict, Lord. A church that starts with women leaders, or some sort of religion which deifies the strong. A kingdom in conflict, Lord. Thank you for this journey, and help us to walk with Paul along that Via Ignata into Philippi and beyond as he spreads the good news of Jesus. And let us also get inspiration for how we can spread that good news too. Amen. Thank you, everybody.